Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Climate Change and Monetary Policy, How Far Have We Come session. I'm very pleased to see you here back today on with the Civil Society webinar. You are important stakeholders and we announced important climate measures today. So I'm really pleased that we have an excellent panel today for you to present the measures we announced. And have a discussion with you to answer your questions and hear your feedback. We have in our panel today Frank Elderson, Executive Board Member of the European Central Bank, Toto Silvonen, Deputy Director at the Market Operations business area, and Elke Heinle, Head of the Division at Risk Management. Both three of them are very heavily involved in the work, and I'm sure they can give an excellent presentation. So Frank, first I want to give the floor to you to give an introduction of all the measures we have taken.
So that means actually all the central banks in the Euro system decided to account for climate change in our corporate bond purchases, in our collateral framework, disclosure requirements, and risk management. So my colleagues here, Toto and Elke, will tell you more about the specificities of these measures. But before giving them the floor, I would like to somehow set the scene by explaining and recalling what the role of the European Central Bank is and how the actions fit within our mandate and what is next. The ECB takes climate change very seriously. And why is that? Well, climate change has clear macroeconomic and financial implications and has consequences for price stability. As such, the ECB Governing Council is firmly committed to address these consequences. These measures announced today are designed in full accordance with the Eurosystem's primary objective of maintaining price stability. And they aim to better take into account climate-related financial risk in the Eurosystem balance sheet. The measures also support, without prejudice to our price stability objective, and with reference to our secondary objective, the green transition of the economy in line with the EU's climate neutrality objectives. Moreover, our measures provide incentives to companies and financial institutions to be more transparent about their, to be more transparent about their carbon emissions and to reduce them. With these measures, we set important steps to systematically and consistently integrate climate and environmental considerations into our activities. But we will not stop here. Looking ahead, the Governing Council is committed to regularly reviewing all the measures outlined above. We will assess their effects and adapt them if necessary to confirm that they continue to fulfill their monetary policy objectives. Two, to ensure within our mandate that the relevant measures continue to support the decarbonization path to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement and the EU climate neutrality objectives. And three, to respond to future improvements in climate data and climate risk modeling and changes in regulation. And fourth, to address additional environmental challenges within our mandate. Now, finally, before I give the floor to my colleagues, let me put our actions in some perspective. Governments and parliaments have the primary responsibility to mitigate the effects of climate change, because they have the most appropriate toolbox to do so. Monetary policy and banking supervision cannot be a substitute for ambitious and decisive fiscal and regulatory action. But nevertheless, we all have a duty to do our part and ask ourselves how we can contribute to the fight against climate change. And this is a task for all of us, including the ECB. Therefore, I'm pleased to announce that today we also publish our ECB-wide climate agenda. This climate agenda provides a comprehensive overview of the climate actions that we are taking at all fronts, from supervision and financial stability to our macroeconomic modeling work and producing our banknotes in a more sustainable manner. With these commitments taken together, we aim to make a real difference with the tasks that we have been given and within the mandate that we have. So thank you once again. Looking forward to a lively conversation and glad to pass the floor to my colleagues.
Yes, thanks so much, Frank, for your introductory remarks. Toto and Elke, please, I think you have a wonderful presentation ready, so I have to give the floor to you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Irene, and good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be here and explain to you what we've been busy with the last 12 months. I thought I'd give a few slides and a little bit background, and then we have the time for our Q&A and hopefully get feedback of any kind from you. So if you move to the first slide, or let's move to the second slide then. You see, well, first of all, let me just clarify that we are doing a lot of work in all areas, in the supervisory side as well, and then also in the finance stability side. But today we focus on monetary policy. And the justification a year ago for these measures that we will now introduce are given from two sides. The first one is that the climate change and the green transition, so both the physical risk and the transition risk, impact different macroeconomic indicators, inflation, but also growth, employment, finance stability, and therefore the transmission of our monetary policy. And that's why we have to take the climate change into account with our operational framework. The second point on the right side is that the climate change as well as transition affects the value and risk profile of assets that we hold on our balance sheet, and therefore leading to greater climate-related financial risk, which we have to manage like any central bank. And so that's a natural part of our monetary policy framework as well. Now, if you move to the next slide, I'll start in the middle. Something that is very typical for any central bank is analytical capacity. And we are, after last year's strategy review, expanding this capacity in modeling and forecasting different economic and financial effects. That's from our monetary policy side. Then the second part of the work for this year is on the left side, which is where we will focus to incorporate these ideas into our framework and operations. And the third part on the right side is more of the ECB at the micro-institutional level. We are also implementing action plan to our environmental sustainability disclosure and reporting. So let's move to the next slide and more specifically on the 4 focus areas. There's actually 6 focus areas. We also work on the statistical data side to improve the data clarifications, and we work with the modeling on the right side. But that's not the topic of today. We will focus on these 4 areas where we have announced actions in each: the corporate bond purchases, disclosure requirements, collateral framework, and risk assessment. So let's move to the more concretely what we have decided. If you move one more slide. So here I'll go clockwise, and I should have introduced Elke Heinle also, who has been a so-called co-lead with me from a risk management side. So everything that we've done, we work together with the markets where I come from and risk management where Elke comes from, but also in very close cooperation, as Frank mentioned, with the legal experts and monetary policy experts. So that means that we have a very comprehensive and holistic approach on any of the measures that we've considered. So today, we have announced that on our corporate bond purchases, we have decided to adjust the market capitalization benchmark to account for climate change factors. And I will tell detail in how we do it, how we plan to do it. The second part, which also was led by so-called market side, is disclosure requirements. We will lean on the CSRD-based disclosure requirements for issuers. I will explain it more in detail. But also there are instruments which are not covered by the regulation, and we plan to act as a catalyst to promote more harmonized mandatory disclosure also for different type of structured finance instruments. And then the third area is collateral framework. We have assessed the different type of risks and come up with a plan for collateral composition limits, as well as integrate climate change risks in our haircut reviews. And the final area is risk assessment. We will externally engage for more transparency in credit ratings, and internally we will set up common standards for Eurosystem in-house credit assessment systems. So if you move to the next slide, we can start with the corporate bond holdings, which are quite sizable, and these holdings can be under our asset purchase program or under pandemic emergency purchase program. So altogether, we hold a little under 400 billion of corporate bonds. Our aim is that we now have decided to set up a tilting approach with an aim to gradual decarbonization of all these holdings on a path which is aligned with the goals of Paris alignment. And our reinvestments, which will start basically from now on, will be tilted towards issuers with better climate performance at the expense or relative to those issuers which have a worse climate performance. And this kind of approach includes three different elements. So we tilt the market capitalization benchmark in favor of, we look backwards, we look forwards, forward-looking indicators, and then we look also for disclosure quality elements. So we will tilt in favor of issuers with lower carbon emissions, that's the backward-looking part. Issuers with more ambitious reduction targets, that's a forward-looking part. And then at the moment, issuers who have a better climate-related disclosures. So all those three elements are included with the so-called climate performance. We plan to start the implementation as of October 22, when we have everything set up in our systems. And additionally, we already announced, I think a couple of years ago, that there will be annual publication of climate-related information on so-called non-monetary policy portfolios, but this will include also our corporate bond holdings. And we start this in the first quarter of 23, and we will plan to do it regularly on an annual basis. Let's move to the second measure. So the second measure is about the disclosure requirements. We will base our eligibility requirement for corporate sustainability reporting directive. This was also announced in the action plan last year. There's been a slight delay due to the complexity of the system, but this agreement has been now reached just some weeks ago among different European institutions, and we will apply our disclosure requirements to all companies within the scope of the CSRD, so all type of non-financial companies. And this will have a gradual kind of application starting from 26. There are currently some larger companies which are already under the current NFRD framework, and then there will be some more large companies that will start to disclose on 27, and finally some large SMEs or unlisted SMEs, listed SMEs in 27. So we will gradually implement these disclosure requirements. But not every type of asset is under the CSRD regulation, and we feel that it's important to support better and harmonized disclosure of climate-related data, particularly from asset-backed securities and covered bonds. And this is because we accept quite a lot of collateral for that type of assets. That's what is mentioned in the first bullet point. This is something that we see our role more as a catalyst, but we will close very closely with European market authorities, for example, the European Securities Markets Authority in case of asset-backed securities. And now I will give the floor to Elke for collateral framework.
Thank you, Tutu. So on the collateral framework, in line with the Eurosystem's action plan, the Eurosystem has reviewed its risk control framework to ensure that climate change risks are adequately reflected. As a result of this review, the Eurosystem has decided to adopt two measures. The first measure relates to the setting up of collateral pool composition limits for each individual counterparty that participates in Eurosystem credit operations. So going forward, the Eurosystem will limit the share of high carbon assets that these counterparties can mobilize as collateral when borrowing from the Eurosystem. At the beginning, this measure will be applied to marketable debt instruments issued by non-financial corporations. This is because here the financial risks are the highest, and also because data quality here is the best. And as this data quality improves, the measure could also be extended to additional asset classes, such as marketable debt instruments issued by financial entities, so-called uncovered bank bonds, and also to private sector non-marketable debt instruments, so-called credit claims or bank loans. The implementation of these collateral pool limits depends on a number of operational and technical preconditions in the Eurosystem's collateral management systems. We expect a go live of this new measure by end of 2024. But to encourage banks and other counterparties to prepare early for these collateral pool limits, we will run tests of the limits regime ahead of the actual implementation. Further details on this will be communicated then in due course. The second measure relates to incorporating the climate risk dimension as part of our regular reviews of the risk control framework. So in concrete terms, we will assess on an annual basis the adequacy of our haircuts that we apply to our corporate bonds that we accept as collateral vis-à-vis the climate risk dimension. So one day, if warranted, we may then apply differentiated haircuts based on this climate risk dimension. For instance, it could be lower haircuts for low emitting corporates or higher haircuts for high emitters. As also pointed out by Frank Alderson, all collateral measures related to climate change need to ensure that monetary policy continues to be implemented effectively. For the collateral framework, this means that all measures need to ensure and will ensure that ample collateral remains available. Let me then turn to the next slide, please. So in the area of risk assessment and risk management, we had committed in our action plan to scrutinize the credit ratings that we use to determine eligibility for our collateral assets, as well as our assets bought in the purchase programs. For our marketable assets, we mainly use the assessments of the credit rating agencies. As you may know, the Eurosystem currently accepts the ratings of the 4 largest credit rating agencies, namely Fitch, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and DBRS. And we have therefore conducted an in-depth research on how these 4 credit rating agencies currently incorporate climate change risks in their credit rating methodologies. While all rating agencies, we really have to acknowledge this, have improved the level of disclosure in recent months, there's still quite some heterogeneity of climate risk disclosure, and there's also still scope for improvement. This heterogeneity is not only across the rating agencies, but it's also across the various asset classes that the rating agencies provide credit assessments for. The Eurosystem will therefore urge further rating agencies to become more transparent about how they incorporate climate risks into their ratings, and to be also more ambitious in their disclosure requirements on climate risks. The Eurosystem is also in close dialogue with the relevant authorities on this matter, in particular, the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA. So for our non-marketable assets, the Eurosystem has put in place several national central banks have put in place so-called in-house credit assessment systems. In Eurosystem jargon, they are also called ICASs. So these ICASs are operated on a decentralized basis by the national central banks and have to adhere to some common rules and principles. To better account for climate change risks in these ratings, the Eurosystem has agreed on a set of common minimum standards for how these systems should include climate-related risks in their ratings. These standards will need to be implemented now in all systems by all national central banks by the end of 2024. Finally, on risk assessment and risk management, let me also recall that our action plan foresees the setup of a climate stress test of the Eurosystem's balance sheet. We have already run a first internal pilot climate stress test that is currently being further refined. We plan to publish our first results in the context of our climate-related disclosures in the first quarter of 2023, in line with our commitment in the action plan. And I then will hand back to Irene. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, Tota, and Elke for the presentation. I think it all shows that we're really moving into the implementation phase, because now we're getting technical. So I want to open the floor to all the participants today for a Q&A. Any questions you may have, also on technical clarifications if need be. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Secondly, it would be great if you can have your camera on, because we can see you and it's a bit more personal interaction. And if you don't speak, please mute yourself. I think you know the tricks for all these conferences. And please know that also this webinar will be recorded and probably or we expect to publish it soon as well on our website. So that's, I think, also good to know. I don't know if I see any hands for the moment. Any questions? Maybe it's all clear. So that's that would have been great. I just because I know there are some experts in the participants room today. So I was hoping that you have questions for us, because we're happy to answer them and also hear your observations. Anyone who wants to break the ice? I noticed that. Oh, I see a hand, and I want to give Martin the floor. Martin, if you could please introduce yourself quickly and then ask your question. Thanks so much.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm Martin Charles-Reed from Coface Families Europe. We're a European NGO representing families and citizens. So I have a question about financial stability and climate change, because there was a lot of focus during the presentation on reporting, monitoring, and creating provisions to mitigate risk. But there seems to be a deeper discrepancy between the debt-based monetary system we have, whose stability relies on nice and stable growth, a rollover of credit into infinity, a stable debt to GDP ratio for states, and a more or less parallel growth of the monetary mass compared to the total amount of available goods and services, with ideally this 2% inflation, which encourages consumption and discourages hoarding money for too long. And then on the other hand, you have the reality of climate change, which will throw a wrench into this nice, stable picture. So the coronavirus pandemic and the war between Russia and Ukraine look like dress rehearsals for the kind of challenges that climate change might bring up, disrupting supply chains, creating demand crunches or supply shocks. Now, do you believe that the ECB, with its limited policy tools, which mostly rely on tweaking the level of interest rates and quantitative easing, are fit for achieving financial and economic stability? And are you considering other monetary theories which could replace the debt-based monetary system to address this fluctuation that will come about with climate change? Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you so much, Martin. I think I can give the floor maybe to Frank, or I don't know who wants.
maybe I can kick off, and
Yes.
then maybe Toto want to add. You know, what I would like to highlight maybe as a more general response to what I might maybe qualify as your cri de coeur, which I understand very well, and that is, you know, will what you propose today, and will that actually, you know, make the difference? And you know, I think the answer is, it goes back to what I said in my introductory word. We at the European Central Bank are not climate policy makers. We are what we say climate policy takers. So the main, excuse me, I have this little cough, so you have to excuse me. The ECB is taking policies as a given by those who are elected officials, who have a toolbox that goes much more directly to climate policies. And that having been said, it is clear that, and I totally agree with you, and you know, climate change is, I think, the biggest challenge of humankind in this century. It is existential. So within our mandate, and I keep on repeating that, and that is relevant. Within our mandate, we you know, we have assessed how climate change affects macroeconomic variables, how it affects growth, how it affects employment, financial stability, price stability, the monetary the transmission mechanism, and hence we see a concrete role for ourselves. But within that hierarchy of actors, if you like. But Toto, please build on that.
Thank you, Frank. I was about to say the same as what you started, is that we are a policy taker, not a maker. And the measures that we've come up today, they should and they will accommodate any monetary policy stance. The stance is the most important decision that the Governing Council decides. And then we have now taken into account this climate change risk, which is more complex and a longer term risk. But we, for the first time, accommodate it or take it in different ways into our monetary policy framework. That's one part, but there are also different dimensions. You mentioned the financial stability risk. That has been discussed and agreed already earlier when Frank started in the NGFS. That was the first kind of agreement among central banks and supervisors that climate change is a financial risk. And our financial stability side is doing the economy-wide climate change stress test to inform which type of oil channels are in general affected. And then we have the supervisory side, which is doing their own part for stress test. And then on the risk management side, I give follow to Elke, but we've kind of brought that stress test back to monetary policy implementation framework level in order to manage our risks. So it comes in kind of different aspects in different levels into the central bank's activities. Elke, would you?
Yes, maybe very shortly. So in line with our focus on the primary objective, of course, what we have done is we really turned every single stone in a way of checking that that climate change risks as a matter of financial risk, that we appropriately accommodate for that. And so as you have seen when presenting the measures, they all have a financial risk component, and that was what was driving also our broad approach on climate change risks. And as Toto has also pointed out, so financial stability is dealt with in a separate work stream on climate change.
Thanks so much to the three of you of giving such a complementary answer of the mandate, and also on how the different activities of the ECB work together on this. I hope this answers your question, Martin. I have another question hand raised from Rens van Tilburg from the Sustainable Finance Lab. Rens, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Irene. Well, I've got one compliment and three questions. So let's start with the compliment. I would like to thank all of you very much for taking these very important steps. I think we're witnessing indeed what you can call a watershed moment with the ECB taking action and going beyond the risk perspective there. I think that was something I found very interesting, that you put so much emphasis on supporting the green transition of the economy. So I think that's our very good developments. Then my three questions. So the first one is, there is this focus on marketable debt instruments, partly also because that's where we have the data for available. But my question is, how do you see the possibilities to actually step up there the action a bit, and not only waiting for the CSRD, but indeed setting a standard yourself as an ECB, for instance, around the collateral framework. So also moving into the bank loans that have already been mentioned, because I would say, and my question is, do you agree with that, that the moment that the ECB would actually put a standard there and say also for the smaller bank loans, we don't want to have too large concentrations in fossil intensive companies, that banks will actually come up with those data. And I think there's also a push from supervision to come up with the same kind of data. And then we don't need to wait for, because that's essentially what you put on the table now, until 2026, before we do this for the largest companies, but we can also do it for the smaller ones. My second question is on the one instrument that I think is still very much missing in action, the TLTRO, which has been identified by the NGFS as probably the most potent instrument for monetary policy. I would say especially for the Eurozone, with its very strongly bank-based economy. And I was actually getting some hope because President Lagarde was talking about this more recently, saying we need to consider this. But I don't see any reference to it. So my question is, are you actually still considering the TLTRO? And the third and last question is, there's a mentioning of a regular review, which I think will be very important. But how regular will this be? So will this be something that we have every year, or, well, happy to hear. But thank you very much for these important steps.
Thank you very much, Rens. Let me start really quickly, and then I'm sure my colleagues will want to add. Actually, I was hoping that you were saying that we would have gotten from you 3 compliments and 1 question, but this is good enough. Maybe starting with the bottom, the regular review. I think it's important that you pick this out from our communication, from our press release, because it shows that we are not saying, we took a year to think about this action plan and this is it. What we have said is that, yes, we have our primary objective, but yes, we also have a secondary objective. And the secondary objective, without prejudice, of course, without prejudice to the primary objective, is there, and it's a legal obligation. And we tend to take legal obligations seriously, as you can understand. So that means, again, without prejudice to price stability, if there's developments in data, in modeling, also broader than just climate, environmentally, we will take further steps. And that means, and this brings me to your question was, how often will we do this? Well, we have not pre-established that. Is the factual answer. We have said that we will, and so to you just explain, we will come out with data in terms of the decarbonization path of our corporate bond holdings. We've also said that we will be in alignment with the EU and Paris climate neutrality goals. So a logical thing to do would be that if we noticed that we were lagging behind that alignment, we would see what we could do more. In terms of TLTRO, I think it's fair to say that having said what I just said, there is no specific instruments that are off the table. But it's also true that the Governing Council, when it's agreed on its action plan, decided on a number of priorities. Those we have now addressed, but it could very well be that in these subsequent revisions, other instruments might come up at some point. Maybe I leave the other question to you, Toto.
Okay. First on this marketable debt versus others, it's true that there's much more data available from corporate bonds, and that's why we take this step to actually make a concrete tilting in our reinvestments. But then we noticed when we went deeper that despite all the talk, there's not really anything even in the pipeline for more harmonized reporting, mandatory reporting in certain asset classes within the euro area. And there we are not the standard setters, but I feel that we can do a lot to cooperate and act as a catalyst and kind of develop together with the institutions which are responsible to have a meaningful and relevant standards that we can then possibly build later on some measures. You asked about the, I guess you meant green TLTRO, even though you talked about TLTROs. That was discussed a year ago, but it was not prioritized for this first year. So we have focused on all these measures at the moment. If one considers ever such an instrument and nothing is outside the considerations, and we gradually move forward with new ideas, but one has to take into account the stance first. What's the monetary policy stance? What type of instruments and measures you in general take? And the second part is about the data. Do you have a harmonized data from all 19 jurisdictions that you can base and really monitor that if you have a certain conditions that they are fulfilled? So we didn't consider green TLTRO at this stage, but it's not completely off the table. And as you mentioned, how often, I would just add that we have always thought that all these measures are scalable, that stance will develop, the data sources will develop. We only have our own sources chosen a month or two ago. So we definitely plan to do this regular review, at least on annual basis. But we first need to have a certain experience, and that will come, for example, when we disclose the emissions of our CSPP portfolio during the first quarter of next year.
Thanks a lot, Toto and Frank. Very clear answer for me. And I want to, Elke, do you want to add something on this?
Just very shortly on the regular reviews, I think as I pointed out on the haircut reviews, so we have committed now to each year to check, to incorporate the climate risk dimension and to see whether differentiated haircuts incorporated the climate change risks dimension are warranted. And I would say when we review any risk framework in the future, we will naturally now also look into the climate risk dimension. I think it has become an integral part of our assessments now. And I think this is a very important step that is thinking. We are really thinking now also in the climate change risk dimension perspective. And on the, just very shortly on the credit claims and by when we would do something, let me just point out on the collateral framework, on the collateral pool limits, we are not going to wait until the CSRD is out there. So if we were doing that, we would need to wait until 2026. But as I said, we are committed to act, to implement by the end of 2024. And this is because we use not the perfect data from the CSRD, but the data from the private data providers now, also using self-reported data to differentiate high and low carbon issuers. And we are now constantly reviewing whether we could also extend this measure to the smaller debtors, so to the credit claims. But we need some data before we can move ahead. But this with our general scrutiny now almost on a daily basis.
Thanks, Elke. I think these are very important additions to the answer that was provided already. And I think it also shows that we've just really incorporated into our day-to-day business. It's not something like climate is something we do separately. No, we really like day-to-day business incorporating it. Now I want to move to the next question, and I have on my list Lucas Krebel from the New Economics Foundation. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Hi, Rena. Thanks. Yes, I'm from the Economics Foundation, which is an NGO working on building a more equitable economy that also works within environmental limits. And I hope, can you hear me all right? Yeah,
Yes.
perfect. Yes, so thanks very much for inviting us here. And yeah, I will echo some comments by others here that yeah, we are very pleased to see you're taking action that focuses specifically on things like carbon footprint or climate impacts and trying to tackle that upfront. So again, going beyond this pure financial risk approach. So that's something that we really welcome. And I wanted to come back to one specific policy area outlined about the corporate bond holdings. So when you talk, about tilting them according to the climate performance, could I ask, it's probably a question to talk about to any of you, tell us a bit more about those metrics. And maybe if it's helpful, because I know you've studied the Bank of England approach to greening its own corporate QE. So maybe if it's helpful, you can compare your approach with what the Bank of England has done, and maybe what are the differences? Are you using the same or similar metrics, or decided to make different choices? And in particular within that also, I would be interested to hear, so one of the criteria you list is better performance on climate related disclosures. So I would like to understand what do you mean by that? Thank you.
So thank you, Lucas, for your questions. So I mentioned that we have 3 different elements, and I think the Bank of England to a certain degree has also elements. But let's take a step back and just consider the size of our corporate bond holdings. We own 25-30% of the entire corporate bond holdings, whereas Bank of England owns only 3%. And our reinvestment flows will be about, let's say, for the next few years, about 30 billion per year. And that's about the size, by the way, of Bank of England's corporate bonds. So whatever we do, we have to think carefully that it still keeps the monetary policy stance intact and that we don't kind of upset the market with our measures. So I mentioned these 3 elements, and we, of course, at the moment, you can really start only with the backward-looking emissions, because that's the only area where you have more data with different type of sources. But that's only one part, and we put the main weight on that part. But then we also want to incentivize any companies to transition towards the green economy and towards the Paris-aligned targets. And therefore, we have this forward-looking target where we look the ambitiousness of the announced target by any of the eligible issuers. And there are about 340 issuers that are eligible for our corporate sector purchase programs. And then we also give a score for the current disclosure quality and level. So what share of the assets, different assets are disclosed. And we put all this together, we made kind of a climate score, and then we adjust based on this ranking of the different issuers, our purchases. And we also plan to include the secondary and primary market purchases because we are active on both, and that's slightly different from the Bank of England.
Thank you, Toto, for answering this question. I think we've covered this one. If I see, okay, and Frank, I don't know if you want to add something on this one.
No, I understand we have quite some questions in the pipeline still.
Yes.
So let's try to be as concise and
yes, that was indeed my next point. We have 15 minutes left and some questions. So I now want to give the floor to Stan Jordan from Positive Money.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed, it's difficult to underestimate how much work has been put into this. So thank you for that. And yeah, it's a bit with emotion that I can think of the first report we wrote a few years ago, and I can see that we checked quite a few policy asks there. So yeah, that's a positive moment for us today. Along the lines of what Lucas just asked, I wanted to be clear on one point, which is on the carbon emissions. Are you including scope 3 there? Because obviously that's an important one and something the Bank of England did not do, I think. And on the Collateral framework, the limit, when you say limit, I mean, can the limit go as far as basically completely excluding certain assets, or not? Are there limits to the limits? I guess is the question. Yeah, third, on the green teltros, and we understand that it was not really in this package because this was about implementing the decision a year ago. And I'm very happy that this package will be reviewed regularly, at least annually. That's good. My question perhaps a bit more broad, but is there a sense in the Governing Council or in the ECB that the decisions made a year ago, how do they match with the new reality that we have today, with the war in Ukraine, with the very high energy prices that are a big source of inflationary pressure? And from that sense, is there a possibility to rethink a bit those decisions a year ago, because now the new reality urges for even more proactive action, I would say. The more the ECB could support, accelerate investment in energy efficiency and renewables, the faster this would reduce some of the sources of inflationary pressure right now, right? In terms of the effect of Russian gas and so on. So, to what degree is the ECB considering this? And if you start thinking that way, then this is not just a single mandate issue. This is actually primary mandate consideration, I would say. So it's a broader question, I guess. But yeah, how is the ECB feeling about this, or at least you, Frank, as a member of the board of the Governing Council? How do you feel about this particular issue? And are you one of those members that Christine Lagarde mentioned as being open to reopening the discussion on Green Tail Chapter? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe I take the third part of the question, and then my colleagues can take the other ones. I noticed that when I said that we were going to be a little bit shorter to give everyone the floor, the questions became longer. But that's very much forgiven, and I understand your questions. I would say that climate change has and everything that we are doing here today has a longer and a broader time frame than looking at current inflation, current geostrategical developments, if you like. It's true that the terrible war in Ukraine has underlined for all of us yet another reason why it is so important to actually make progress in the energy transition. So if you allow me, what I would draw from that is that the likelihood of that transitioning happening has increased. It is not just being pushed now solely by climate considerations, but also by, if you like, energy independence consideration. So from our perspective, it means that the policymakers in terms of climate policies, i.e. in the EU, in the end, the co-legislators, are probably more likely to continue on a path that they were, by the way, already pretty determined to continue. So in that sense, I would say these developments are relevant. But over to you, Elke and Toto.
Maybe I can take the second question, and then Toto takes the last one. So on the collateral limits, so in fact, yeah, indeed, if you put the limit at 0, one could completely exclude bonds, but then we would have said it's exclusion. So we are not going to put the limit at a level of 0. So because we do not want to exclude any assets. And also, as I mentioned, it's important that ample collateral remains available. That means for all asset classes. So we have to duly calibrate the measure and also in particular this limit, such that we do not unduly constrain the sufficient collateral availability, and also the measure needs to be proportionate. But as mentioned before, there will be more detailed announcements on the details when we come closer to the implementation date.
So thank you, Stanislav. I'm glad that you asked the first question, because that's one difference, as you alluded to. I mentioned the 3 elements we use for the tilting scoring, and we use scope 1 and 2 for all those elements. But then in addition, for the backward-looking part, we don't use at the issuer level scope 3, but we have included it at the sectoral level. So we kind of do a combination of a best-in-class and best-in-universe in order to take the most meaningful sectors into account. So that is now taken into account, and we see that it will be in the future EU benchmarks and a regulation as something that will be reported better and better. And we felt that it's not yet appropriate quality level on the issuer level, but we can take it into account to a certain degree at the sector level. And just to complement the second point on the sales or exclusion, Elke mentioned collateral. I can just mention that a year ago, Governing Council gave guidance that we should think about an inclusive approach and not sales at this moment. And we can make the tilting so that we will align towards the Paris-aligned path without the sales with our portfolio.
Thanks again for the answers to the question. I see we're running a bit out of time, so I would like to ask everyone to put their questions in the chat in case we don't have time to answer them all. We can come back to you in another way, in written format. But I think we have time for one last question, and that is from Michael Human from Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Irene. It's a short one, follows a couple prior. Obviously, looking at emissions disclosure and CSRD is an important starting point, but we have many NGO partners, technical partners, many investors and governments, the UK, for instance, with its transition plan task force, which is really looking beyond this basic disclosure towards really more detail about what companies are doing to transition their businesses and their performance in doing that. And if you had any thoughts you could share quickly about how you might be looking to evolve the technical frameworks here over time, and the opportunity for all of us to partner with you in doing that, because we obviously need to ultimately focus on detailed transition plans and performance alongside these baseline disclosure indicators. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your question. I think that's a very important topic that we will focus on more. We've so far used the kind of entire Eurosystem force to learn these things together and being in touch then on an individual basis. But that's something that we plan to do, maybe think more in the future, that which would be the best way to focus on the ambitions of those transition plans. Of course, we try to follow the kind of best standards which exist in the market, and I think we probably come up with more details closer to October when we start our tilting.
And maybe to add more generally, Michael, to your question or your offer that you stand ready to engage, I think more generally, I would like to just invite all of you. We have a climate change center. Irene, as many of you know, leads that, and we have a team of people that stands ready to engage also outside this a little bit more formalized conversation that we have today. So in the coming months, the coming years, whenever you have insights, trying to understand what we are doing, and you feel that you have knowledge that could be helpful for us, please reach out.
Yes, thanks so much, and I just want to echo Frank. Please reach out. We're stand ready, and it's a journey we're on together. And your input is very much valued by the European Central Bank. With this, I want to ask. I think we're closing soon, and I think a survey will appear soon on your screen. If you have a few seconds or minutes to fill that out, that would be great. And maybe, Frank, you want to say a few last words for now, or You've done that already.
I mean, I can do that. And, you know, I think, let me put it this way. It is reassuring, two things. One, that many of you who have, and I think it's a super useful role that you play, who have critically followed us, are critically following us, are saying, we recognize that today the ECB is making real progress. I think that's valuable. That is something that you give back. And at the same time, you stay true to your role by saying, but you know, there's so much more that one could consider, and we continue to have ideas that we want to share with you, and we want to invite you to take seriously. So I think that combination of things is you know, is extremely welcome. I hope that you, on the basis of the last years and what we are doing today, that you feel that we do try to take seriously any insights that you give to us, and I hope this sets the tone for many years to come, so that together with all our stakeholders, and you are a very important part of that, and as I always say as a lawyer, within our mandate, we can do as much as we can in this super important challenge of climate change.
Can I just add my thanks as well to all of you, because many of you have contacted us and sent your proposals, and as Frank mentioned, they are very important. They give us thoughts. We then work with the nuts and bolts kind of level and see that what's possible, what's appropriate, with all the considerations we have with monetary policy and legal issues. But the ideas are really welcome, and we can also check that whether we have thought everything. So many thanks to everyone.
Thanks a lot, Elke, Frank, and Toto, the three of you, for setting out our measures that we have taken and answering all the questions. Thanks a lot of all the participants today. Thanks for listening to us. Thanks for engaging with us. Now I want to round up this hour with you, and I'm looking forward to further engagements with you, and wishing you a very, very nice day. Thanks so much.